Aldrich Ames, the quiet betrayal that gutted Mosque. He didn't look like a crisis. Mid-level, rumpled, with a drinker's bloat and a charm that came and went with the hour, Aldrich Ames had exactly the kind of access that makes damage invisible until it's fatal. He knew who mattered inside the Soviet system because he'd recruited and handled some of them. He read the cables that distilled their lives into intelligence. He sat in rooms where names were said out loud, then folded back into compartments that were supposed to be airtight. Debt pressed on him, pride pressed harder. That combination has wrecked more empires than artillery. The story starts small. In 1985, Ames walked himself into the KGB's arms. No elaborate entrapment, no honeyed approach. He made the first move. He brought a sample to prove value. Names. Those names were currency with a brutal exchange rate. The Soviets paid cash. He took envelopes that felt like solutions to every nagging bill and every nagging slight. He told himself it was manageable, compartmented, a transaction among professionals. Then the money started changing his life, in ways even a dull auditor could spot. Get this, he stopped hiding it well. He deposited cash in chunks that should have triggered alarms. He bought a new house beyond his declared means, paid off debts, treated friends, upgraded suits. He joked about a windfall. Bankers saw deposits as deposits. Supervisors saw a gregarious officer talking big and drinking bigger. Polygraphs. He'd failed before and recovered with explanations and a second chance. Charm plus policy inertia equals a pass. He knew the system he was robbing. He helped write parts of it. Meanwhile, Moscow bled. Within months of his first contact, assets began to roll up. Not all at once, strategic pointers first, so the pattern wouldn't scream, but the crown jewels went dark. A colonel who'd fed military plans for years was arrested. A scientist with access to R&D vanished. A party insider stopped signaling and never resurfaced. The KGB ran the arrests in a way that mocked CIA tradecraft, staggered timing, controlled leaks, quiet trials. From afar, it looked like opaque Soviet churn. Up close, it looked choreographed. Here's the twist that hurt morale most. Ames didn't sell methods. He sold people. He handed over identities knowing exactly what would happen. Some were executed. Some were imprisoned for life. Some were turned into propaganda. The human weight of that choice sat nowhere visible on a balance sheet. Inside CIA offices, case officers read the damage assessments and recognized handwriting. They'd written some of the cables that built those dossiers. They felt complicit and powerless in the same breath. So why didn't the alarms peg earlier? Blind spots stacked. Ames's supervisors knew his drinking and his uneven performance. That made him look like a management problem, not a national security threat. Financial anomalies got waved off in a culture that still treated lifestyle checks as formalities. Polygraphs gave false comfort with their own mythology. Fail once, pass again, call it nerves. Groupthink did the rest. He was one of us, the kind of officer you rescue rather than suspect. Special investigations tightened the box around him after those bank timelines lined up with asset arrests. They didn't move fast. They couldn't afford a miss. They watched him shop, tracked conversations, mapped commutes. They saw patterns that matched classic agent behavior, seemingly purposeless drives, sudden turns, pauses near parks where dead drops could sit for hours. They found garbage with traces of tradecraft, torn paper, careful burn patterns, mundane items that looked too curated to be accidental. Still, the case needed corroboration beyond inference, so the team widened the net to his communications and his contacts. They built a picture of his time in Rome, where his access had been deep and his finances had first started shifting. They pulled on threads that ran through his marriage and his social circles. They studied his confidence in small moments, how he answered open-ended questions, how he deflected timelines, how he shrugged when asked about Moscow, as if the bleeding were an act of nature. Meanwhile, the KGB kept collecting on his treachery. Ames continued delivering names through the late 80s, then into the early 90s, as if the Cold War's end were a cosmetic remodel rather than a structural shift. His betrayal straddled the fall of the Soviet Union, proving a grim point. Ideology wasn't the only motive, and geopolitics didn't retire greed. The operational effect stayed brutal. CIA's Soviet division, later Russia division, was operating with a hollowed-out source base. trying to rebuild while the floorboards still creaked. This was the moment everything changed, the morning grab. After months of surveillance and internal legal choreography, the FBI and CIA coordinated a clean takedown in 1994. They boxed him in on his commute, pulled him out of his car, and read rights that felt more like an obituary for a decade. In interviews, he didn't spin legends. He gave a flat confession that landed like a dull hammer. Yes, he'd spied. Yes, he'd taken money. Yes, he knew what the names meant. He wrapped it in grievances, underappreciation, career stagnation, the usual poison that tastes like justification. The damage assessment that followed wasn't just a list. It was a memorial. They counted operations degraded or destroyed. They listed code names that now belonged to prisons or grav. They mapped secondary effects, the sources those sources would have brought, the insights analysis never got, the policy choices made in the dark because someone had flicked the switch. The tally stretched beyond Moscow. Liaison services saw the pattern and pulled back, wondering if sharing with the CIA was a risk to their own people. Inside Langley, the soul-searching turned into paperwork with teeth. How did Ames pass polygraphs after failing? Why did financial flags get waved away? Who signed off on travel and access for an officer living beyond his pay grade? Managers who protected him out of habit or misplaced loyalty found themselves under scrutiny. The post-mortem didn't treat this as a singular monster problem. It treated it as a systems problem. Systems had trained people to ignore the odd because the odd was awkward. And get this, catching Ames didn't stop the leaks. Even as he went into a cell, operations kept feeling pressure that didn't align with his access alone. That meant there was another hole, maybe more than one, and it might not be in the same building. The CIA had to live with the cognitive dissonance of victory and failure in the same headline. They'd nailed the man who wrecked Moscow, and yet Moscow still moved like someone else had the keys. Ames's story forced the agency to confront its own self-image. They were not just hunters, they were vulnerable. They could be beaten by a colleague's hunger and an adversary's patience. They had to accept that counterintelligence wasn't a season of penance, it was the climate. Elevate CI from compliance to craft. Treat lifestyle reviews as intelligence operations, not HR chores. Stop worshipping polygraphs as talismans. Build financial monitoring that can read context, not just numbers. Reward officers who ask corrosive questions before clapping for those who bring shiny sources. For the people who'd carried the human cost, reforms felt late and necessary. One case officer kept a list of first names of sources lost after 1985 pinned behind a cabinet door, invisible to visitors, but impossible for him to ignore. When Ames's face hit the news, he closed the door a little harder. At sentencing, the narrative was clean: traitor, greed, betrayal. Inside the building, the narrative was messier. We let this happen because we liked being comfortable. Meanwhile, his confession gave investigators a reference point. They used it to close loops, to confirm which compromises were his and which were something else. The something else kept pointing across the river to another institution with its own culture and its own blind spots. The hunt wasn't over, it was changing shape. And while Ames sat behind bars, the real lesson settled in: you can arrest a man, you can't arrest complacency. The cleanup would take years, the scars would last longer. And the second knife was already out. The second knife, Robert Hanssen and the FBI's shadow war. While Langley tried to breathe after Ames, another leak kept whispering through operations that shouldn't have been touched. CIA fixed procedures, tightened compartments, and still, sources burned in ways that didn't map to Ames's confessed reach. The psychological toll was immediate. Old instincts felt contaminated, and even routine briefings tasted like risk. Suspicion drifted across the river. The Bureau's counterintelligence shop guarded domestic lanes and watched foreign services on US soil. If a second knife existed, it might be strapped under an FBI desk. Robert Hanssen didn't look like a fire. He looked like a church-going, rule-quoting career man who could recite Bureau policy from memory and scowl at anyone who bent it. He'd been in and around counterintelligence since the late 70s, absorbing how the Soviets hunted and how the US hunted back. He knew the CIA's rhythms from liaison, knew which programs lived behind extra doors, and crucially, knew where the seams between agencies turned sharp. That seam knowledge was a key. He used it for himself. His method was suburban calm weaponized. No dramatic meets in smoky alleys. He favored dead drops near parks, bridges, and wooded strips that looked like weekend jogging routes. Packages wrapped in plastic, taped with care, tucked under footbridges or behind signs. He wrote letters to the KGB and later the SVR with a pedant's flourish, precise, condescending, sometimes lecturing them on tradecraft like a tutor correcting a student. He encrypted some notes, masked others behind simple codes. He insisted on no face-to-face contact. He sold secrets with the arrogance of a man who believed he'd never be measured. Stakes: he had keys to rooms the CIA couldn't enter without a visitor badge. He touched FBI cases that monitored Soviet and later Russian officers in the US, saw human source reporting routed for deconfliction, and read technical program summaries that sketched capabilities in careful language. That meant his betrayals could expose CIA sources by triangulation, connect the who with the how, and deduce the where. It also meant he could tell the Russians which American programs were blind spots, which ones weren't, and where to push. Meanwhile, CIA analysts trying to square post-Ames anomalies kept finding leak signatures that felt domestic. Programs unrelated to Ames's compartments suffered odd interference. A source in Eastern Europe got nudged by a counterintelligence move that smelled like foreknowledge, not luck. A technical effort aimed at a foreign embassy saw equipment mysteriously degrade after a routine maintenance window. None of that proved an insider at the Bureau. But it pointed toward a second insider somewhere, and the spotlight moved. Rivalry didn't help. CIA and FBI had long memories and fresh bruises. The agency suspected the Bureau of hoarding. The Bureau suspected the agency of freelancing. Meetings where they shared just enough turned brittle. Now add fear. If the mole sat inside the FBI, then every word said to the wrong ear was another loss. If the mole didn't, accusing the Bureau risked tearing the partnership when they needed it most. Leaders tried to choreograph joint reviews without igniting turf fires. It half-worked on good days. Hanssen exploited the grey. He'd been selling since around 1979 in intermittent bursts, pausing when risk felt high, resuming when the heat cooled. He took cash, diamonds, and the one currency he craved most, validation that he was smarter than his peers. He wrapped his motives in talk about ideology and bureaucratic rot, but the ledger always balanced in his favor. He warned his Russian handlers how to handle him: never try to meet, keep the system elegant, keep him anonymous. He signed as Ramon at times, a ghost with instructions. Impact arrived in ripples that became waves. US sources in Moscow and beyond surfaced in Russian files at moments that didn't correlate with Ames's access. Technical programs got burned in ways that suggested inside detail, not educated guesswork. A double-agent operation run by the Bureau fell apart with unnatural speed. CIA's liaison with the FBI on certain sensitive compartments got curiously leaky. The agency tightened. The leaks persisted elsewhere. The effect was corrosive. You start asking whether your partner is compromised, and that question infects every plan. Parallel tracks formed. CIA kept cleaning post-Ames house and red-teaming its own assumptions. The Bureau, pressured by evidence and by the CIA's increasingly pointed questions, formed internal cells to hunt a traitor among their own. The Bureau had to sneak up on itself. That meant compartmented teams, unusual for a culture that relies on chain of command and case ownership. It meant watching veteran agents without tipping them. It meant living with a kind of institutional vertigo that Langley already knew too well. Here's where the plot tightened. A file surfaced from Russian hands years after the Soviet collapse, purchased at real cost. It contained fragments, letters from the unknown FBI mole, operational details, tradecraft notes, a sliver of a fingerprint on habit, not ink. The voice on the page sounded like a man who loved rules as a language he could weaponize. He criticized the Russians for sloppy security while giving them gold. He bragged without names. He left enough metadata for careful minds to chase. The Bureau built a profile that fit too neatly to ignore. Senior CI experience, access to specific cases that lined up with burned operations, a personality that could write with superiority and insist on control. They added a technical breadcrumb. A Palm Pilot used by the suspect contained fragments of encrypted files. On its own, not a smoking gun, but another chord in the same song. Surveillance wrapped around Hanssen's suburban routine, church, office, home, a park that would matter later. They let him run a little longer to see the pattern in motion. He drove to parks with a bag that always looked slightly heavier than its size. He paused near a footbridge in Foxstone Park, a place he'd used before, a place that felt like his private stage. He checked for tails with the quiet competence of a man who wrote the checklist years ago. He still missed details because arrogance blinds the best operator. The Bureau had hidden in places he didn't think to look. The takedown had its own choreography. They picked a day he believed was safe, let him place a package at the drop, and closed the ring in a parking lot as he walked away. No drawn guns in the cinematic sense, controlled, fast, words that felt like iron. He asked, "What took you so long?" according to those there. That line, true or polished by memory, captured the tone of his letters. He wanted the last shot to sound clever. He didn't get it. Damage assessments read like echoes of Ames with a Bureau accent. Which sources burned through his reach? Which technical programs lost years of cover? Which joint operations took hits because he telegraphed their edges? The tally stretched across agencies and across time. It included lives, careers, and capabilities honed at great cost. It also included trust between CIA and FBI, between operators and their own institutions. Hanssen had turned the rivalry into a weapon. He made them doubt each other to survive him. Two moles, two cultures cut open, one problem that now looked structural. You could lock up Ames and Hanssen, but you couldn't lock up the conditions that let them thrive. Gaps between agencies, overconfidence in internal vetting, and the habit of mistaking compliance for security. The Bureau reworked its insider threat posture. The CIA pushed harder on joint counterintelligence centers, and both tried to stitch a seam that had become a wound. It wasn't a victory lap, it was triage. And for operators still on the street, the lesson landed practical. Assume the adversary studies your partnership as closely as your tradecraft. Assume the second knife is already in play. Build your plans so a single betrayal hurts but doesn't blind. The shadow war wasn't agency versus agency. It was the inside versus everyone else. The reckoning inside Langley. Culture, hubris, and broken systems. By the time Hanssen's cuffs clicked, the mood at Langley wasn't relief. It was a dull, necessary anger turned inward, shame braided with determination. Postmortems became the daily grind. Not the kind that writes a clean narrative. This was a line-by-line audit of the agency's beliefs. Incentives got the first hit. For years, the machine rewarded product, not prudence. A neat briefing beat a messy question. The operator who brought a new source got applause. The CI officer who asked if the source was clean got side-eye. Compliance sat in the chair where curiosity used to sit. Checklists had replaced conversations. You could pass a polygraph and pass a financial form and pass a refresher course and still be a problem. Managers learned to read green lights as security rather than as minimum thresholds. That blindness wasn't malicious, it was comfortable. Tools turned into talismans. The polygraph's aura did the worst damage. It made people lazy about asking the harder thing, does this story make sense? The Ames mess had proved the danger. Hanssen made it embarrassing. Both made it unforgivable. CI had long been treated like an immune system you suppress because it makes you itch. The reckoning flipped that. Counterintelligence became the blood work, not the aspirin. The agency elevated CI posts, routed sensitive operations through officers trained to think adversarially, and forced red teams into planning rooms where they'd been whispered about but rarely invited. It wasn't theater. It was survival. You don't catch a future Ames by hoping he twitches on a graph. You catch him by building processes that punish assumption. Tech fetish took its licks too. Satellites and sensors had earned their place, but the aftermath proved the cost of treating them as a cure-all. The agency had leaned hard on imagery and signals, while HUMINT atrophied under pressure. That imbalance made it easy to believe that Moscow's bleeding could be offset by cleaner pictures elsewhere. It never worked. The reformers pushed a different model, use tech to enable humans, not replace them. The Moscow rules got rewritten in a digital font. Assume every byte leaves a trail, and every trail is read by a thinking adversary. Management failures marched across whiteboards, who ignored bank flags,